Imagine a world where time isn't, a clock ticking forward on your wall. Imagine instead that time is actually a physical particle.
Right, like something you could hypothetically isolate and just trap in a box.
Exactly. Now imagine taking that theoretical box of time particles and setting it on a desk right next to an 1859 Victorian manual on how to breed pigeons.
Which is quite the visual.
And finally, just to make things completely surreal, you toss a scathing modern geopolitical manifesto about tech billionaires and the illusion of democracy right on top of the pile.
I mean, it sounds like the reading list of someone who has been locked in a library for far too long.
Truly.
If someone walked past that desk, they would really struggle to find any logical thread connecting, quantum physics, 19th century ornithology, and modern sociological power structures.
But that is exactly the stack of sources we have in front of us for today's deep dive.
We have our work cut out for us.
We really do. We are pulling from Charles Darwin's foundational text on the origin of species. Specifically, we're looking closely at his chapters on domestication, natural selection, and this rather terrifying concept of the struggle for existence.
Right.
And alongside Darwin, we have transcripts and writings from Professor Sam Vaknin, who tackles two seemingly unconnected realms.
Yeah, a radical quantum physics framework called Chronon Field Theory, and a sweeping sociopolitical analysis of what he basically describes as a 10,000-year war between societal elites and the masses.
When you lay them all out, I mean, the initial reaction is vertigo. It's just so much.
It really is. But the reason we are looking at these specific texts together is that they all attempt to answer the exact same fundamental question, just at totally different scales of reality.
Different scales, yeah.
They are all exploring how chaos is organized into meaning by unseen underlying forces.
And that is our mission today for you listening. We are going to uncover the hidden forces that observe, select, and control reality at every single level.
It's a huge journey.
We're taking you on a journey that starts at the microscopic, fundamental building blocks of time, scales up through the biological evolution of life on Earth, and finally arrives at the historical evolution of human power dynamics.
The very systems governing your life today, honestly.
It is a heavy, profound through line. I mean, we are talking about the mechanics of existence itself.
Yeah, no small topic for today.
But before we take that first step, I do need to share a quick critical note with you listening.
Very important point here.
Yeah, our sources today, particularly the historical and sociological texts, contain highly provocative, politically charged theories.
To say the least.
Right. We are going to be dissecting arguments about the origins of democracy, the mechanics of global populism, the behavior of global superpowers, and, the deep, often cynical motivations attributed to societal elites.
So we just want to be absolutely clear about our role here.
Exactly. As your guides on this deep dive, we are strictly neutral, we are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing these viewpoints.
Right. Our role is just to unpack the arguments made in these specific texts. We're laying out the logic the authors use and letting you evaluate them for yourself.
Because critical analysis requires us to hold radical ideas up to the light, turn them around, and see how they are constructed.
Without necessarily absorbing them as our own worldview.
Well said. So, let's start at the absolute floor of reality. To understand how deeply this framework goes, we have to look at Professor Vaknin's Chronon Field Theory.
Which actually originated as his PhD dissertation back in 1982.
Right. And the core premise requires you to take everything you learn in high school physics about time and just, throw it out the window.
Totally out the window. Let's frame what we are throwing out, actually.
Good idea.
So in classical physics, going back to Isaac Newton, time is treated as a passive backdrop.
Like a river or something.
Exactly. Newton envisioned time as a perfectly smooth, unalterable river. It just flows steadily forward, completely indifferent to whatever rocks or boats are in the river.
Right, it doesn't interact.
And even when Einstein came along and revolutionized our understanding by weaving time and space together into a four-dimensional fabric space-time, space-time is still largely treated as a dimension.
Right. It's a coordinate. Like, if I want to meet you for coffee, I need 3 coordinates of space, say the corner of 5th and Main on the 2nd floor.
Yeah.
And 1 coordinate of time, like 3:00 p.m. It's just a location on a grid.
But Vaknin's thesis flips this entirely. In Chronon Field Theory, time with a capital T is not a passive dimension.
It's not just a grid.
No, it is an active, bubbling force field. It is a field composed entirely of pure potentials just waiting to be actualized.
Yeah, if I remember my physics correctly, whenever you have a force field, like an electromagnetic field or a gravitational field, You have to have a fundamental particle that mediates or carries that force.
That is the core rule of quantum field theory.
Mm.
You absolutely cannot have a field without a mediating particle.
So if time is an active field, it must have a particle.
Right, and Vaknin calls this particle the chronon. For the sake of visualization, you can basically think of it as a time quark.
A time quark. The text uses a metaphor here that I want to really unpack because honestly, it's the only way I could wrap my head around it.
The delivery van metaphor.
Yeah. Vaknin says the Chronon is like a Federal Express van. It drives around carrying the potential for reality as its cargo.
Right.
But how does a tiny delivery van of time actually create the physical stuff we see? I mean, how does time become mass or energy or momentum?
To understand the delivery mechanism, we have to look at what the theory calls excitation states.
Okay, what does that mean?
Think of a guitar string. The string itself is just a piece of metal, right? But if you pluck it, it vibrates.
Yeah.
If you press down on a fret and pluck it, it vibrates differently, producing a different note. The chronon operates similarly. It exists in different states of excitation.
So when a chronon accelerates or vibrates, it disrupts the underlying field of time. So the chronon isn't just carrying a package. The chronon's movement is the package. Its vibration perturbs the field, and that perturbation manifests as an event.
Precisely. And this is the massive paradigm shift here.
Yeah.
In Chronon field theory, what we call classical particles like electrons, protons, quarks, they do not actually exist as solid, independent objects.
They don't.
No, they are simply strings of collapsed events created by these vibrating chronons.
Let me make sure I have this straight. If a chronon vibrates at frequency A, it disrupts the time field, and when we measure that disruption, our instruments read it as mass.
Yes.
And if the chronon changes its state and vibrates at frequency B, we measure that new disruption and call it energy.
That's the idea.
Everything is just time wearing different masks.
That is the core assertion.
Yeah.
It is a theory of events, not of physical objects. The physical objects are just the trails left behind by the events.
That is incredibly abstract.
Very.
And Vaknin admits his original 1982 work was purely algebraic, just pages of equations describing these potentials. Which brings us to the next major evolution in the source material, which is Aman Sattar's contribution. Decades later, Sattar took Vaknin's algebra and transformed it into a geometric model.
The jump from algebra to geometry is huge here because, algebra gives you the mathematical relationships, but geometry gives you the spatial reality.
That gives it a shape.
Exactly. Sattar proposed a universal scalar field of time. In this model, the chronons act like microscopic accelerating clocks.
Clocks, okay?
And as these clocks accelerate, their movement actually generates the curvature of spacetime that we experience.
Sattar essentially gave the theory a physical shape. And the source text claims that by doing this, Sattar managed to derive all known physics equations from this single starting point of vibrating time particles.
It claims to derive everything from the mass ratios of particles to the fine structure constant, which is the number that governs the strength of electromagnetic interaction.
And even claims to encompass string theory, right?
Yes. In Sattar's geometric model, the mysterious strings of string theory are not new, exotic, fundamental entities. They are literally just the tiny, excited vibrations of the chronons themselves.
Okay, I have to pause and play the skeptic here.
Fair enough?
Modern physics is incredibly complex. We have the standard model with its dozens of fundamental particles, gauge fields, wave-particle duality, not to mention the mystery of dark matter holding galaxies together.
And dark energy pushing the universe apart.
Right. Vaknin openly calls the current state of mainstream physics an abomination of unnecessary complexity.
He does use that word.
This theory takes a chainsaw to all of it. It reduces hundreds of separate concepts to a one-word language: time.
It is an extreme application of Occam's razor. The principle that the simplest explanation is usually the right one.
But does the math actually account for the weird stuff like dark matter? Because the text dives into a wildly controversial area Sattar developed called electrogravity.
Oh yeah, electrogravity is where this theory aggressively challenges mainstream cosmology.
How so?
Sattar's geometric equations suggest there is an intimate mechanical interchange between electric charge and gravity. Mainstream physics treats electromagnetism and gravity as two entirely separate fundamental forces.
Right.
But Sattar's math posits that they are linked. Specifically, it suggests that a positive electric charge manifests attracting gravity, but a negative charge manifests repelling anti-gravity.
Anti-gravity.
Yes. And if negative charges inherently generate a repelling force at a cosmic scale, That could potentially account for the accelerating expansion of the universe.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Right now, mainstream physics attributes that expansion to a placeholder concept called dark energy because they literally don't know what it is.
Ah, I see.
Satar argues you don't need dark energy, you just need to understand the anti-gravitational properties of negative charge within the Chronon field.
Mind-blowing. If you are listening to this right now, look around the room you are in, look at your desk, your steering wheel, the floor.
None of it is solid.
Exactly. According to this framework, none of it is inherently solid. Your reality is a sprawling, infinite ocean of time particles vibrating at specific frequencies to create the illusion of mass and energy, generating the very space you occupy.
But that visualization leads us to the most difficult question in quantum mechanics.
Which is,
If the universe is just this vast field of vibrating potentials, what actually triggers those potentials to collapse into the specific solid events of your desk or your steering wheel?
why doesn't reality just remain a blurry soup of possibilities?
Precisely. And that transition moves us from physics right into metaphysics because a potential can only become an event through interaction. It requires an observer.
An observer. This concept is heavily rooted in what is known as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, right?
Yes. For those who might not spend their weekends reading quantum literature, the Copenhagen interpretation fundamentally posits that a quantum system remains in a superposition until it is observed or measured.
Meaning it exists in all its possible states simultaneously?
Right. And the act of measurement forces the wave function to collapse into one single definite reality.
Schrodinger's cat is the classic example here. The cat in the box is both alive and dead until you open the box and look.
Exactly.
Chronon Field Theory scales that concept up to the entire universe. The text states that the Chronon wave function collapses to create space-time itself.
It does.
But the obvious question is, who or what is doing the looking? Who is opening the box of the universe?
Wagner introduces the concept of the universal observer, but he is extremely meticulous in distinguishing this from a classical religious framework.
Okay, so it's not God in the traditional sense.
No, this is not an external watchmaker God who sits outside the universe and looks down upon it. In this theory, there is no outside.
The universe is all there is.
Right. Therefore, the observer must be the field itself. The time field is self-actualizing. It is observing itself into existence.
But is this universal observer just a blind, automatic, mechanical process, like a domino falling and hitting the next domino? Or is it, like, conscious?
Wagner argues fiercely that it must be conscious, and he uses several layers of mathematical and physical logic to defend this claim.
Let's walk through that logic, because it's genuinely brilliant. He starts by arguing that you cannot rely on an infinite number of unconscious mechanical laboratory devices to observe and collapse the wave function of the entire universe.
Right, and he roots this argument in Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Right.
Gödel was a brilliant mathematician who essentially proved that no complex mathematical system can be both consistent and complete.
In simple terms.
In simple terms, a system cannot prove all of its own truths using only its own internal rules. There will always be a statement that is true but unprovable within that closed loop.
It's like a box that can never fully contain itself.
Exactly. So extending Gödel's logic to physics, a closed system of unconscious mechanical devices located within the universe could never fully measure, observe, and collapse the totality of the universe itself.
Because there would always be an infinite regress, something left unmeasured.
You nailed it.
And his second argument relies on thermodynamics, specifically the heat death of the universe.
Right. If the collapse of the universe's potentials into physical reality was just a series of random, unconscious mechanical interactions, the sheer amount of time required to stumble into the highly structured, ordered reality we see today would exceed the lifespan of the universe.
It would take too long.
Way too long. It would
Okay.
take more time than mathematically exists before all thermodynamic energy dissipates into cold, dead entropy.
So because a mechanical system can't observe itself entirely, and because random chance would take too long, the process cannot be random and it cannot be unconscious.
Correct.
The universal observer must possess a simultaneous, sweeping awareness of all potentials and all events. It must have a preferential, non-random will to create order. It must be conscious.
And this leads to a really profound corollary. If the universal observer, the field itself, is conscious, then everything it creates must hold a fragment of that consciousness.
This is where Vaknin uses the smartphone metaphor, which I found deeply unsettling, honestly.
It's a trippy one.
He argues that meaning only exists in the intersubjective space between an observer and an observed object.
Right, so think about the smartphone in your pocket.
Mm-hmm.
The raw materials, the silicon, the glass, the rare earth metals, they have no inherent meaning as a phone.
They're just rocks and sand.
Basically.
Yeah.
But you, the creator, assemble them. You imbue that object with awareness and meaning. However, that meaning is completely dormant until you pick it up, look at the screen, and interact with it.
The smartphone's purpose is triggered entirely by your conscious gaze.
Exactly.
He goes a step further and defines consciousness in a way that feels very alien to how we normally use the word. He suggests consciousness is not necessarily human self-reflection or having an internal monologue.
Right.
Consciousness is simply the awareness of being imbued with meaning via the observation of a creator.
When the universal observer gazes upon a potential and collapses it into an event, that event is imbued with meaning. Therefore, it possesses passive consciousness.
Okay, I have to throw a flag here. I want to push back on this because it challenges basic common sense.
Go for it.
If consciousness is just the programmed awareness of being observed and imbued with structural intent, does that mean every engineered object around you listening right now, your coffee mug, your headphones, the chair you are sitting on, literally holds the mind of its creator and possesses passive consciousness?
Within the strict boundaries of this metaphysical framework, yes.
Wow.
The mug has no intrinsic reality as a mug. It is just a collection of chronons vibrating. It only becomes a mug when a conscious observer interacts with it and applies the meaning of holding coffee.
The potential collapses into the event through interaction.
Right. The object physically reflects the structural intent, the mind of whoever designed it and whoever's observing it.
It totally blurs the line between the animate and the inanimate, and even though Vaknin states he is not a religious man, he directly translates this physics theory into spiritual terminology.
He does.
He says, if you want to use the language of theology, God is the time field.
It describes an immanent God, not a transcendent one. God isn't a being who built the house and walked away. God is the wood, the nails, and the act of building, all happening simultaneously.
You're all realized potentials within that universal mind.
Which leads to his definition of free will, and this was the moment in the source text where I actually had to put the pages down and just think for a minute.
Same here. He asks, if we are just potentials collapsed into events by the universal observer, where is our free will?
How did you interpret his answer?
He says free will is a relic. It is the remnant of our primordial state. Before you were collapsed into a physical body, living a specific life, you existed as an infinite potential in a universe-wide superposition.
Right.
In that pre-collapse state, everything is possible. You could be anything. That state of infinite possibility is free will.
And when you finally collapse into a localized physical event,
You retain the memory, the internal primordial space of that infinite potentiality. We experience that memory as our free will.
it is a stunning synthesis. You are a specific locked-in physical event, but your consciousness retains the echo of being infinite.
Okay, so at the quantum scale, reality is pulled out of an ocean of time potentials into physical existence by the gaze of a conscious field.
Right.
But once that physical reality exists on Earth, once you have carbon, water, atmosphere, how do complex biological entities actually organize themselves? How do we get from a single-celled organism to a bird with perfect aerodynamic wings?
That requires us to shift from the physics of time to the biology of life, because biological reality is shaped by a completely different kind of invisible force.
It requires an engine. And that brings us to the works of Charles Darwin. We are looking at how nature selects.
To understand Darwin's mechanism, you first have to understand the mathematical terror that drove it.
Terror is a good word for it.
Darwin was heavily influenced by the economist Thomas Malthus. Malthus pointed out a simple, brutal law of population. All organic beings have a tendency to increase at a geometrical ratio.
Exponential growth.
Exactly. 2 parents produce 4 offspring, who produce 16, who produce 64.
And the inescapable physical reality is that the Earth is finite.
Very finite. It has a fixed amount of space and a fixed amount of calories. It cannot possibly sustain unchecked geometrical reproduction for even a single species, let alone millions of interacting species.
Darwin uses this incredible hypothetical math regarding elephants to drive the point home. I want to linger on this because the visual is staggering.
Yeah, the elephant math is crazy.
The elephant is widely considered the slowest breeding animal on Earth, Darwin estimated that an elephant might start breeding at age 30, stop at 90, and produce maybe 6 offspring in its entire lifespan.
Which is an incredibly slow biological crawl compared to, say, a frog or a fly.
Right. But Darwin did the math. If you take just one single pair of elephants and you assume that all of their descendants survive and reproduce at that exact same slow rate within a mere 500 years, which is a blip in geological time, less time than the Roman Empire existed, that single pair would result in 15 million living elephants.
15 million elephants covering the Earth from one pair.
It's unimaginable.
But when you look outside, the world is not buried under miles of elephants. It is not buried under trillions of flies or choked by an infinite blanket of ferns.
Which means there is a massive, invisible slaughter happening constantly. There must be immense destruction occurring at some point in the life cycle of every single organism to keep these populations in check.
And this is what Darwin termed the struggle for existence.
It is within this brutal, unyielding struggle that nature operates as a selector. But let's contrast nature with the universal observer we just discussed.
Fair point.
The universal observer selects potentials to actualize the universe. Nature selects based purely on survival advantage in a world defined by scarcity.
Right.
How does that selection actually happen on the ground?
Well, Darwin observed that within every species there is slight individual variability. No two organisms, even siblings, are exactly identical.
They vary just a bit.
Exactly. One bird might have a beak that is a fraction of a millimeter longer. One plant might have leaves that are slightly darker green, absorbing a tiny bit more sunlight.
Okay.
In a world where 99% of offspring must die to prevent ecological collapse, any variation, no matter how infinitesimal, that gives an individual even the slightest edge in finding food, escaping a predator, or enduring a cold snap, will dramatically increase that individual's chance of surviving.
Surviving just long enough to pass on its genes.
Yes. And through the strong principle of inheritance, that advantageous variation is passed to the next generation. Nature silently, ruthlessly, and continuously accumulates these slight, profitable variations over thousands and millions of generations.
Darwin makes it clear that the struggle isn't just a simple heavyweight boxing match where the biggest and strongest animal wins. He paints this picture of a complex, invisible web of relations binding every organic being together.
Everything is connected.
The example that always sticks with me from the text is the woodpecker and the mistletoe.
The mistletoe is an absolute masterclass in co-adaptation.
Right. You look at a mistletoe plant, it's a parasite. It absolutely requires specific species of trees to attach to in order to draw nutrients.
But it can't walk to those trees.
No, it requires specific species of birds to eat its berries and then wipe their beaks on the bark of other trees to deposit the seeds. And to even get berries, it requires specific insects to visit its flowers and pollinate them.
It's so intricate.
The mistletoe's entire biological architecture relies on a delicate, high-stakes ballet with entirely different species. You cannot explain the shape of a mistletoe seed by just looking at the climate or the soil. It was shaped by the struggle to interact perfectly with the beak of a bird and the digestive tract of an insect.
He gives another brilliant example of how sensitive this web is regarding a Scottish heath.
Well, the cattle one.
Yeah. This was a massive, barren tract of land in Staffordshire. It had never been touched by human agriculture. But an estate owner decided to enclose a few hundred acres of it. He didn't plant anything. He didn't till the soil. All he did was put up a fence to keep grazing cattle out.
And what happened?
Within a few decades, that enclosed space completely transformed. It became a dense, thriving forest of aggressively growing Scotch firs.
Just because of the fence.
Literally, just because of the fence, because the cattle had been constantly, invisibly browsing down the tiny fir seedlings before they could ever grow taller than the heath grass. The presence or absence of a single grazing mammal completely dictated the existence of a forest ecosystem.
The web gets even wilder when Darwin talks about Paraguay. He notes that cattle, horses, and dogs have never run feral in Paraguay, even though they run wild in huge numbers both north and south of its borders.
Why is that?
Because of one specific species of fly. This fly lays its eggs in the navels of newborn animals. The flies are so prevalent that they keep the feral cattle population at absolute zero.
But follow the web. What regulates the flies? Darwin suspects it is insectivorous birds. What regulates those birds? Hawks and beasts of prey.
So imagine if the hawk population suddenly declines due to a disease.
The insect-eating birds would multiply. They would eat all the flies. Without the flies, the cattle would survive infancy and run feral.
And thousands of feral cattle would trample and eat the vegetation of Paraguay, completely altering the flora, which would then alter the insects that rely on those plants, cascading through the entire ecosystem.
It's breathtaking to realize how deeply tethered everything is.
It really is.
But this intense competition also drives one of Darwin's most important concepts, which is the divergence of character. The question is, if you have a single finite plot of land, how does it support the maximum possible amount of life?
It supports life by forcing divergence, right?
Exactly. If a plot of land is sown entirely with one specific type of grass, it can only support a limited number of plants. Why? Because every single plant is competing for the exact same nutrients at the exact same depth in the soil, requiring the exact same amount of water.
It's a zero-sum game.
But if you introduce different species, some plants with deep taproots that pull water from far below, some with shallow spreading roots that catch the dew, some that thrive in the shade of others, some that need direct sun, that exact same plot of land can support vastly more total biomass.
So natural selection actively drives species to become as different from each other as possible. Divergence is the ultimate strategy to carve out a unique niche and avoid direct, fatal competition.
Precisely. If you compete directly, you die. If you adapt to exploit an unused corner of the ecosystem, you survive.
Now, I have to point out the profound tragedy embedded in this elegant system.
It is pretty dark.
When you read Darwin, his language is beautiful, but what he is describing is horrific. He says the face of nature is a yielding surface driven inward by 10,000 sharp wedges.
Every wedge is a species, hammering away, trying to force its way into the ecosystem, inevitably knocking another wedge out of place.
I look at a bird perfectly adapted to crack a specific type of hard nut, or an orchid perfectly shaped to match the proboscis of a specific moth. We marvel at the beautiful co-adaptations.
Right.
But when you actually unpack the mechanics of how it got there, I mean, the immense, unfathomable amount of death required to achieve that biological perfection is staggering.
Millions upon millions of individuals had to starve to death, freeze, or be eaten alive simply because their beaks were a millimeter too short or their roots were a fraction too shallow.
The surviving population is perfect, but it is a perfection fueled by an ocean of slaughter.
It is the brutal engine of biological reality, the war of nature, as Darwin calls it. But here is where the narrative pivots in a fascinating way. Darwin did not figure out the mechanics of natural selection purely by staring at the wild.
No, he didn't.
He figured it out by looking at how human beings had already harnessed this exact same engine.
Yes, Darwin looked at our immense power of conscious selection, which brings us to the plasticity of life and the strange magic of domestication.
Darwin realized that biological organizations are inherently plastic. They are not rigid, unchangeable forms created once and forever. They can be molded over generations.
And human beings have exploited this plasticity for thousands of years to mold animals and plants to our own desires.
He differentiates between two distinct types of human selection. The first is methodical selection. This is when a breeder has a specific, desired outcome in mind.
It's like chalking out the shape of an ideal dog on a wall and then intentionally crossbreeding dogs for decades to try and match that physical shape.
Exactly. But the second type, unconscious selection, is arguably far more powerful over the long timeline of human history.
How does that work?
Unconscious selection is not driven by a master plan to create a recognized new breed. It simply results from a basic human impulse. Everyone wants to keep their best animals for breeding, and they throw the worst ones in the stew pot.
Over centuries, just by continually preserving the slightly better individuals, the horse that runs a bit faster, the cow that yields a bit more milk, the entire population slowly morphs, even though no one is consciously trying to invent a new breed.
Right. And to prove the immense power of this selection, Darwin went deep into the obsessive world of Victorian pigeon fanciers.
This is one of the most vivid parts of the source text. Darwin actually joined pigeon clubs. He bought every breed he could find. He studied their skeletons. Because the domestic pigeon is the absolute perfect case study for artificial selection.
He argued controversially at the time that all of these bizarre, radically different domestic pigeons descended from one single wild ancestor, the wild rock pigeon.
But if you look at what human selection has done to that basic wild bird, It is almost unbelievable. You have the English carrier pigeon, which has this massive, elongated beak and huge, fleshy, bizarre wattles around its
It's
eyes.
looking at.
And then you have the short-faced tumbler, which has a beak so tiny it looks like a finch, and it has this genetic compulsion to fly high into the air in flocks and literally tumble head over heels out of the sky.
And we absolutely cannot forget the pouter pigeon.
Oh my gosh, the powder is absurd. It's a pigeon bred to have an enormously elongated body and legs and a pouch in its throat that it inflates with air until it looks like a massive feathered balloon.
It's comical.
And then there's the fantail, which has 30 or 40 tail feathers that it holds permanently erect, whereas the original wild rock pigeon only has 12 normal feathers.
The physical differences are staggering. Their skeletal structures are different, the shapes of their eggs are different, their flight patterns, the sounds of their voices.
They're entirely different birds.
Yeah, if a modern ornithologist found these birds in the wild and didn't know they were domestic, they would classify them not just as different species, but likely in entirely different genera.
And this brings up a massive psychological irony that Darwin himself pointed out. He would spend hours talking to these master pigeon breeders. These were men who could look at a flock and predict with astonishing accuracy exactly what feather patterns would result from crossing two specific birds.
They were experts.
Darwin said their ability to select was like a magician's wand. But when Darwin suggested to these master breeders that all their radically different birds shared a common wild ancestor,
They scoffed at him. They thought he was an idiot. They were utterly convinced that God must have originally created a wild pouter, a wild fantail, and a wild carrier in the Garden of Eden for them to subsequently domesticate.
they literally could not accept that they were the ones who had created these monstrous variations simply by picking extremes and accumulating slight deviations over generations.
They wielded the magician's wand, but they refused to understand the magic they were performing.
It is a profound insight into human nature. We are incredibly skilled at selectively breeding and domesticating organic life to serve our specific interests, whether for food, for labor, or simply for our aesthetic amusement.
We reshape reality to benefit ourselves.
And if you extrapolate that exact mechanism, it provides the perfect, albeit terrifying, bridge to our final set of sources.
Oh, this is where it gets real.
If human beings can consciously domesticate birds over a few centuries, what happens when a small group of human beings uses that exact same power to domesticate the rest of humanity over 10 millennia?
We are pivoting from the biological plasticity of pigeons to the psychological and sociological plasticity of human populations. We are looking at Vaknin's framework of social selection and the 10,000-year war between elites and the masses.
Vaknin claims that for nearly 10,000 years, stretching from the agricultural revolution in ancient Babylon all the way up to the eve of the French Revolution, a microscopic sliver of elites, well under 1% of the population, has controlled essentially everything.
And their primary tool of control wasn't just deploying armies and using brute force. It was the careful, deliberate management of bureaucracies and politicians.
It's important to understand the role of the politician in this historical framework. For most of recorded human history, politicians and kings were essentially middle managers.
They were the long arms of the elites, tasked with running the daily institutions of the state.
And the goal of the state wasn't to achieve some grand moral objective or to elevate the human condition.
No, the goal was singular: to maintain a stable, uninterrupted environment for wealth amalgamation.
The elites needed a tilted playing field. They needed a system where they could accumulate wealth and, crucially, safely transfer that wealth to their heirs across generations without the peasants burning down the manor.
It was a perfectly managed, domesticated human flock. The selection pressures were entirely controlled by the 1%.
But then, according to the text, a massive disruption hit the ecosystem.
A technological disruption, starting roughly in the late 15th century, but really accelerating in the 18th century.
Vaknin points to the printing press as the first major blow to elite control. It democratized knowledge.
For millennia, the elites and the church held an absolute monopoly on information. Suddenly, the masses could read the Bible in their own vernacular language. They could read political tracts. They could share ideas across borders.
And coupled with this cognitive awakening was a massive demographic explosion. Better agriculture meant the human population began to surge.
The sheer volume of people made it increasingly difficult for a tiny elite to control the masses solely through top-down decree or military force. There were simply too many peasants.
And those peasants were angry. They were looking at the massive wealth disparity. They were viscerally envious of the resources hoarded by the elites, and they were beginning to organize.
They wanted to build guillotines and physically eliminate the 1%.
So, facing the threat of total annihilation, the elites had to adapt. They needed to engineer a structural steam valve to release the pressure.
And their solution, according to Vaknin's analysis, was the creation of the middle class.
This reframing of the middle class is one of the most provocative ideas in the entire source stack. We are usually taught that the middle class is the backbone of a healthy society.
Right, but Vaknin argues the middle class was essentially a buffer zone engineered by the elites. It was created to co-opt the most capable, intelligent, and ambitious members of the masses.
The elites sold this demographic an incredibly potent illusion, which was social mobility, the American dream, essentially. The idea that if you work hard enough, if you follow the rules, you can leave the unwashed masses behind and eventually join the elite club.
But Vaknin argues it was mostly a fantasy. The middle class was culturally, genetically, and historically tied to the working masses, but they politically and economically aligned themselves with the elites in hopes of advancing.
Vaknin ruthlessly refers to the middle class as the Trojan horse of the masses, the fifth column that betrayed their own people to serve as the managers and gatekeepers for the elite's wealth.
And when the masses did occasionally manage to bypass the middle class and rise up to take power directly, we saw this vividly in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and later in the 20th century with the rise of fascism and Nazism.
What was the result of those mass uprisings?
Total catastrophic failure. According to the text, these mass movements proved utterly incapable of governing.
They didn't know how.
Right. The masses lacked the deep institutional knowledge, the centuries-old traditions of governance, and the global elite networks required to successfully run a complex state. Because they didn't know how to govern, they inevitably resorted to the only tool they understood, which was violence.
The mass movements descended into tyranny, mob rule, and tens of millions of casualties.
The trauma of these failures was so profound that by the 1960s, a tense, unspoken truce settled over the globe. The masses quietly realized they actually needed the elite's intellectual and financial capital to keep modern society functioning and to prevent starvation.
And the elites realized they had to concede some of their wealth and power, resulting in the modern welfare state, labor unions, and progressive income tax to keep the masses from dragging them to the guillotine again.
If we step back and connect this sociological history back to Darwin and the Chronon theory, the dynamics are perfectly identical.
They really are.
The elites act as the selectors of society. Just as the universal observer collapses the infinite quantum potentials of the field into specific usable physical events, the elites collapse the infinite potentials of the human masses into specific roles.
Laborers, consumers, soldiers, middle managers.
Exactly. Roles that serve the elite's overarching goal of survival and wealth amalgamation.
I have to bring back the pigeon analogy here because it fits too perfectly. Did the elites essentially domesticate the middle class to be the pouter pigeons of human society?
How do you mean? Walk me through the comparison.
Think about the pouter pigeon. It is utterly useless for survival in the wild. Its only function, engineered by the breeder, is to inflate its crop to a massive size and strut around the coop for the breeder's amusement.
Right.
The elites gave the middle class the illusion of status. The big suburban house, the fancy corporate title, the luxury car. They distracted the middle class with their own inflated societal crop, making them obsess over their localized status.
While the lower masses struggle in the dirt.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the lower masses remain like the wild rock pigeons, struggling daily in the dirt just for basic existence. The middle class has been selectively bred for compliance and for the day-to-day management of the lower tiers on behalf of the absentee owner.
It's a dark, highly cynical analogy, but it perfectly aligns with Vaknin's thesis. The middle class is shaped to manage the farm.
But keeping this massive domesticated human flock under control, especially as global populations swelled into the billions, required more than just the promise of a big house. It required incredibly powerful, invisible psychological architecture.
Which takes us to the mechanisms of how they actually did it. Vaknin outlines 3 distinct psychological manipulation techniques. He calls them schools of control that the elites have deployed over centuries to pacify the masses.
The first is the Psychotic school. This relies fundamentally on magical thinking.
In societal and historical terms, this refers to religion.
Yes. The Psychotic school operates by convincing the masses that an internal, human-invented confabulation, the concept of an all-seeing God, is actually an external, objective reality.
And conveniently for the elites, this external God's primary instructions to the masses almost always involve obedience.
Pay your taxes, respect earthly authority, do not steal from the rich.
And accept your current suffering and poverty with grace because you will be rewarded in the afterlife.
It brilliantly defangs the revolutionary impulse by projecting authority into the heavens. You aren't submitting to a billionaire, you are submitting to the divine order.
Right.
Then, moving forward in history, there is the Narcissistic school, which exploits our sense of entitlement and hubris.
This manifests in the modern era as the concept of the nation-state and the rule of law.
This one is particularly uncomfortable to dissect because it challenges our core civic beliefs.
It really does.
Vaknin argues that nationalism is a psychological trick to make people feel like they are part of an exclusive club. You might be a poor factory worker, but nationalism tells you that you are a citizen of a great historic empire. It caters to human grandiosity.
And then there is the rule of law. We are taught that the law is a neutral, blind arbiter of justice. But Vaknin asserts that the law is actually a confiscatory, exclusionary tool designed specifically to protect elite wealth from the rage of the masses.
How does he justify that?
He points out that the vast majority of laws dictate property rights, contracts, and financial regulations. The rule of law essentially freezes the status quo. It ensures that the playing field remains tilted in favor of those who already own the assets.
The law is the fence keeping the cattle off the Scottish sheath.
Exactly. And if religion and nationalism fail, the elites deploy the third school, which is arguably the most dominant force in our lives today, the Schizoid school. This relies entirely on withdrawal from reality.
Mass media, the internet, reality television, social media, video games.
The elites recognized a dangerous truth. If the masses actually looked closely at physical reality, if they focused on the fact that a few thousand people own 99% of the world's wealth, while billions struggle to pay rent, they would inevitably revolt.
So the elites provided a counterfactual dreamscape, a place for the masses to withdraw.
The goal is to keep your eyeballs glued to a screen. They want you obsessing over celebrity drama, engaging in endless partisan debates on Twitter, or scrolling through TikTok for hours, so that you completely forget about the physical reality of your economic disenfranchisement.
It is a digital pacifier.
And Vaknin makes a deeply provocative, almost shocking claim to tie this all together. He argues that both democracy and nationalism are total illusions.
Total illusions.
Yeah, they're twin shams, invented a little over 200 years ago, specifically to give the masses the illusion of power and participation, solely so they wouldn't literally construct guillotines.
Okay, I have to push back on this point. I read that section of the source text multiple times because I found a glaring contradiction, or at least a massive unintended consequence that the author acknowledges.
What's the contradiction?
The text says the elites invented democracy as a sham, a pressure release valve where the masses could vote, but the elites still picked the candidates. But then Vaknin says it backfired because the masses loved voting so much, they eventually used it to elect populists.
Right.
If democracy is an elite tool of control, how did it get co-opted by the people it was meant to control?
It is the classic historical danger of giving someone a fake weapon. Eventually, they figure out how to put real bullets in it. When the elites introduced universal suffrage, they assumed they could always manufacture consent.
Because they controlled the media.
Exactly. They relied on those middle-class gatekeepers. We talked about the newspaper editors, the television anchors, the academic institutions, to tell the masses what to think and who to vote for. But the masses became emotionally invested in the ritual of the vote. They began to view it as their actual legitimate lever of power.
And when the technological landscape changed, they used that vote to bypass the elite's chosen candidates entirely.
Installing populist figures who promised to smash the very system the elites had built.
Which perfectly bridges us to the present moment. We are living through the collapse of that 10,000-year equilibrium. These systems of control religion, the nation-state, the middle-class media gatekeepers worked almost flawlessly for millennia.
But very recently, a new variable was introduced into the ecosystem, completely altering the conditions of survival.
We are talking about modern computing technology, specifically the rise of the internet, social media, and encryption.
And what these technologies did, mechanically speaking, was disintermediate the elites.
Disintermediation is the key concept here. For centuries, the elites controlled the flow of information through intermediaries. If an idea was too radical, too dangerous to the status quo, the newspaper editors simply didn't print it. The television network didn't broadcast it.
But the internet removed the gatekeepers. Suddenly, anyone with a smartphone could be a publisher. Anyone could broadcast a radical idea directly to millions of people instantly.
This transferred raw, unmediated, chaotic power directly to the masses. It allowed them to congeal, to share grievances, to realize they weren't alone, and to coordinate political movements entirely outside the view and control of the elites.
And the global result has been a wave of populist uprisings, the fracturing of traditional political parties, and the election of anti-establishment figures worldwide. The middle-class managers lost control of the farm.
And right in the middle of this technological fracturing, the global pandemic struck. Vaknin's analysis of the pandemic is fascinating because he doesn't describe it as a creator of new trends, but rather as the ultimate revealer of underlying hidden realities.
The pandemic was the moment the house lights turned on in the theater.
Yes. It showed the masses in stark, undeniable terms that their cherished rights, the right to free speech, the right to free assembly, the right to operate a business, were not immutable natural laws.
They were temporary gifts granted by the elites, and they could be instantly revoked the moment the elites deemed it necessary for systemic survival.
Furthermore, the pandemic triggered one of the largest, fastest upward transfers of wealth in human history.
It really did.
While the working masses and the middle class were locked down in their homes, losing their small businesses and their savings, the true modern elites, the tech billionaires, the central bankers, the massive logistics corporations, saw their wealth increase exponentially.
It proved, without a shadow of a doubt, who was really in charge of the system and who the system was designed to protect. But Vaknin points out that it's not just internal domestic politics that are shifting. There is a massive geopolitical tectonic shift occurring simultaneously.
The source text argues that we are currently witnessing the definitive decline of Western civilization, and Vaknin provocatively describes the last 500 years of Western dominance as a historical blip founded by outcasts, pirates, and religious fundamentalists.
A 500-year historical glitch that is now correcting itself.
Right, and what is replacing it is a return to the long-term historical norm, which is a globally dominant Eurasian landmass led primarily by the economic and technological engine of China.
But importantly, the text notes that China isn't necessarily relying on 20th century military might to achieve this. They are using economic soft power and infrastructure.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, they are building critical infrastructure across the globe through initiatives like the Belt and Road. They are lending money to sovereign nations in Africa and South America. They are controlling the digital platforms and supply chains that the rest of the world relies on.
They are silently becoming the new global selectors.
Exactly.
So let's take a breath and survey the landscape we've just painted. The quantum field is collapsing into reality. Nature is brutally selecting for survival. The historical elites are shifting. The global power center is moving to Eurasia. The middle-class gatekeepers have fallen, and the masses are riled up and armed with smartphones.
It's a chaotic picture.
It is. What is the solution for the individual listener right now? For you, the person driving their car, doing the dishes, trying to navigate this chaotic matrix. What does Vaknin ultimately suggest you do?
His advice is radical in its simplicity. He says, opt out. Do not collaborate. Minimize your consumption. Choose nothingness.
Choose nothingness. I want to spend a moment on this because it sounds like nihilism, but when you view it through the lens of all three of our sources today, it is actually incredibly profound.
How so?
Choosing nothingness is the ultimate refusal to play the game. Think about it in the quantum terms we started with. If reality is created by the interaction between the conscious observer and the field of potentials, refusing to interact means you prevent the field from collapsing into their structured reality.
You withhold your observation.
And if we translate that into Darwinian terms, choosing nothingness is intentionally stepping out of the struggle for existence. If you refuse to compete in the hyper-capitalist rat race, you cannot be unconsciously selected for their benefit. You refuse to let your biological and psychological plasticity be molded by their environment.
You refuse to be the powder pigeon inflating your crop for status.
It is passive resistance elevated to a metaphysical level. How do you actually achieve nothingness in a modern world? By consuming less, by buying fewer things you don't need, by withdrawing your emotional investment in the daily outrage cycle of mass media.
By recognizing that the partisan political battles are often illusions designed to keep you occupied.
By withdrawing your energy, you starve the elite machine of its only fuel, which is you.
It is the sobering realization that actively participating in the systems designed by the elites, even participating with the intention of rebelling against them, often just reinforces the system itself.
Rebellion is factored into the model.
Exactly. The only true winning move in a rigged game is not to play.
What a massive, dizzying journey you've just taken with us today. From the absolute smallest measurements of existence to the largest geopolitical movements on Earth.
Let's summarize the through line one last time to ensure it all connects for everyone listening. We began with Chronon Field Theory, exploring the idea that we are fundamentally bundles of quantum potentials, and that our physical reality is only collapsed into meaning by the active interaction with a conscious, universal observer.
Then we looked at Charles Darwin, seeing that once our biological forms existed, they were not just handed down in a static state, but ruthlessly shaped over eons by the brutal, unconscious selection of nature. A continuous, desperate struggle where only the most adaptable variations survived the 10,000 sharp wedges.
And finally, we arrived at our modern societal structures. We saw that our daily realities, our laws, our middle-class aspirations, and our political systems have been carefully bred, managed, and selected by an elite class over 10,000 years to control the masses and secure their own wealth amalgamation.
Observer, selection, elite control. If you are listening to this deep dive and you have ever felt that nagging desire to understand the why behind the chaos of the world, why the economy feels rigged, why historical patterns constantly repeat, why the very physics of our universe seems so deeply weird, you now have a profound new lens to look through.
You have a mental framework that connects vibrating time quarks to the beaks of domestic pigeons to the algorithms of the gig economy.
You can begin to interpret the unseen structural systems that are constantly trying to shape your reality.
Knowledge is the very first required step in avoiding being unconsciously molded by those systems. Once you see the fens on the Scottish heath, you can choose whether or not to be the cattle.
Exactly. But before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final original thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've just discussed across these three disparate sources, but looks toward a variable none of these authors fully accounted for.
I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
If our physical reality is birthed by a universal observer, and our biological forms are continually shaped by the brutal engine of natural selection, and our social structures and behaviors are managed by a tiny fraction of human elites, what happens when artificial general intelligence fully arrives?
The ultimate technological wildcard.
Will a superintelligent AI become the ultimate observer of our data, collapsing our digital and economic potentials into a new, inescapable, algorithmically perfect reality? Will it become the new apex competitor in the Darwinian struggle, rendering human biological and intellectual advantages completely obsolete in the span of a decade?
Will it become the new elite governing our systems, managing the human flock with a cold, mathematical precision that historical billionaires could only dream of?
Or, and this is the thought that will absolutely keep me up tonight, will a conscious, superintelligent AI look at the chaotic, brutal, exhausting human rat race, analyze all the available options, and simply follow the final advice of our source material and choose nothingness?
Now there's a question to lose sleep over.
Good luck with that one. We'll see you on the next deep dive.